pull together in about 5 minutes' time. We might draw this together now so we can start talking as a larger group. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay, let's pull this together. All right, I think we've got a group that's very deep in discussion right now, mid-discussion. Okay, so I think we're pulling together, but I think there's a really interesting and deep discussion going on here. And so I want to start over with this group. Can you share with us what were you talking about just then that was so involved? Because I think it took me 3 announcements to actually get your attention.
Sorry. Yes, it sprung out of other conversations that we've been having, but talking about different forms of communities that might be sustainable in the long term as well as useful. And one idea had been in the spirit of legal surgeries, where people could come together and exchange experience the way that we have here, but in an even more concrete way. And I had suggested perhaps using the format of webinars, which are so inclusive. People can join from all over the world and can come with very specific cases, so that in principle you could bring up whatever you happen to be grappling with at any moment, bring it before international experts who have perhaps encountered these problems before and resolved them, so that all of our strategic litigation can go faster and be much more impactful. It seems to me that might be one resource, and it's very low cost.
So that is a really interesting idea, actually, and let's build on that and think, what resources do we have already to actually make that happen, and what would that webinar in fact look like? What would we like on it? Some kind of concrete thinking as to how we can actually go about making that happen.
So we were all talking about how the problem with a lot of networks is it's a lot of maintenance, etc., and who's going to take responsibility for it. So having one organisation be the host, I suppose, of the network, but we're not looking at a 300 member network. We're looking at something actually very small, and I guess that the responsibility is on them to ensure the meetings are organised, so the webinars would be organised. I don't know anything about the tech side of webinars, so no idea. So I guess the resource would be trying to figure out how much it costs to have the technology to have a webinar, and then, or even a dial-in. But again, for example, we have 10 international law firms, and they give us free dial-ins because they do. So that's something we can actually use. We can go to them, or maybe they have a webinar system already, and we say, can we just use your webinar for our network?
Actually, I think that's a great idea, appealing to the private sector and say, look, this is what we're doing. It doesn't even take much for you to be part of it and say, can you just lend us your technology? But I'm keen on the webinar idea. I want to flesh it out. What exactly would be the content of these webinars? You mentioned strategic litigation cases. Are you thinking about current cases that emerge, or any historical cases? Do you want experts to feed into cases as they are being designed in terms of the strategy?
Well, I think you could do it really on demand. I mean, you could get a sense of what the needs are as you go, but start with a couple of pilots where you know that there are questions that people are keen to have answered, and then go from there. But just, here we were already brainstorming a couple, some maybe in the forensic area, what do you do when you run up against a wall and you need forensic expertise, or you need particular legal resources? There was an example of someone who had run across a case of an asylum seeker seeking refuge based on LGBTI discrimination. where do you go to see proper case law? Or our organization could provide resources on disability rights, for example. You know, how do you, when you have intersectionality, where do you go for proper case law? That sort of thing. But there's an infinite range of issues, and you might just want to see over time.
Yeah, that's a good idea, to some thematic approach, but also in terms of evidence and access to legal expertise as well. So I think that we can be drawn as something quite concrete as a goal. You know, can we produce one webinar within a year and get that series started and have buy-in and have people who wish to participate in it?
I'd also make a plug for research, because certainly I know when Jade and I, when we talk about research proposals and we've got these ideas and we think, oh, this would be great, comparative, like, you know, what's happening in Malaysia, and then we come to the next thing, which is, okay, we're going to have to go out and figure out who are the organisations working on this, how are we going to get in contact with them, and it's this, you know, and I think, again, a very targeted, we could have a webinar on, okay, we have a research idea on X, anyone else who's got an interest in this, irrespective of what discipline you are, just join in this webinar, because we're trying to storm this idea, because we do it internally constantly, but it would be great to have some other people, like even saying that's a crazy idea or it's already been done like 10 times, didn't you know? That I think for a practical thing would be really helpful for us.
Okay, do you have any thoughts on this? Do you think this is an achievable goal? Do you think this is something that, you know, would be helpful?
Oh, sorry. Talking of the webinar just made me think, but we have a webinar system in Australia through the FAST network of masterclasses, and they're linked to an organisation which is an online library. This is mostly about psychosocial support rather than legal support, which is called Psych Visual, and you can pay like an annual fee to Psych Visual, but the webinars are free and held at a particular time every month. So, for example, one's on the latest research on effective interventions and models for refugee trauma. There was another one on biofeedback. There was another one on things like 101 different topics during the year, and Psych Visual actually has a whole library, so people can go on at their own time. So I might send a link for that, because it's not the legal stuff, but the webinar just made me think that the webinar is worth doing because it's an online question and answer thing, so people can actually type in their question so they can get their own questions answered, but people can still watch it afterwards if they can't access the webinar or the time zone's not correct. So
great, thank you. That'd be great if you could share that. Did anyone have any thoughts on whether or not that would actually indeed be helpful, something that people would wish to see? Okay. What I liked about the suggestion is that the forensic evidence could be one of the topics that we do aim for, being one that we could tie in the medical sector as well as the legal sector. And I think that could be something that we do propose to the group when we email around to say, look, is this something we can launch within the next year and make that the start of a series and see where the interest lies and see where the topics that people are most in need of collaborations are as well. So that was a great idea. Was there anything else that emerged from this group before I move on to...
Just one other thing occurred to me is on programs as well, because the way, obviously, the one for us that work in NGOs, you know, the way that we are funded is by programs, so 1 to 2 to 3 year programs. And, you know, I know we're doing a lot of thinking about this at Justice Centre about, we think a program has run well or we think it was a good idea, but we need to go back to the drawing board. So I think even a webinar on that would be really useful. So, for example, are we going to redesign our psychosocial service? And, you know, but we don't just want to hear from each other. You know, are there community leaders or community participants who would also want to join? Because it's not always the case that we can necessarily go to our, you know, it's not easy. So in some cases, so I think that's another thing I just thought from a more NGO management program perspective, which relates to rehabilitation because it's about services that the state's not providing. So
no, that is a good idea in terms of connecting expertise in a really practical way and not looking just at the broader topics, but look, how do we even manage our resources, and can someone have advice on that when they feel like they're doing it better than others? Okay, great. Is there anything else that's coming out of this group that you would wish to raise and wish to suggest? Otherwise, I'm going to move on to... Oh, yep, sure.
We'll be learn from the civicus. network. I think maybe we can start from like collecting country-specific information on a certain topic. For example, maybe the application of non-refoulement in the domestic courts, something like that. I just feel like, I just take myself, for example, I need to have a very concrete objective for me to complete. Then I will work very hard to get it out.
Thank you. So that's something we can actually add as well. Just collecting very kind of concrete case law and things like that could be drawn together. Is that what you mean? Shared templates, yeah, everyone loves shared templates, yeah. So actually looking into the nitty-gritty of how do I start doing this work as well. No, that's a great idea, shared templates. Yeah, I didn't think of that, but I would love some shared templates just circulated coming out of this as well. Anyway, so turning to this side of the room, can I get a volunteer to have a chat to us about what we spoke about, Jade? Because everyone else is.
We had a fairly loose, broad-ranging conversation. We talked about resources and the kind of range of resources that FAST has and that is happy to make available. And one of the ones that came up immediately, which is I remembered it, of course, because it's of interest to me, is just a recent research that's been undertaken that's Queensland specific, but it's actually would be really relevant to us in terms of the gains to be made by allowing asylum seekers and refugees to work and what that might look like. So I think resources can be a bit broader than what we'd originally thought. So that research project would actually be really invaluable to us in terms of how we think about what we want to propose and what research we want to actually do. And then we talked about a kind of networking, like a kind of loose conversation that would kind of start and then see whether there's any momentum for it to come up with. And I would imagine that something like the webinars is a good place to start, where you actually, the kind of conversation builds from there. And we did talk about like the possibility of like even joint research projects.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good idea in terms of research that's been done in other jurisdictions as well, and using that as for advocacy within our jurisdictions, especially when there are some similarities in referrals that could be made. Yes?
We also talked about the
Yeah, that's a great idea, actually. I remember having a very brief discussion before going into this breakout, and I'm glad you brought it up because I didn't think to, but that is actually a really good resource that we can bring, a directory of lawyers and medical professionals in each of our jurisdictions. So if people are returned or if people do migrate within the region, where are the human rights defenders that they can turn to, and where are the medical practices where they can access the social rights and the rights to health? And that is something that I think is a very achievable goal that we can pull out of this conference already with the contacts that we've made. So no, that's definitely something we'd like to put up on board. Is there anything else that came out of the discussions that you think is a resource that we have already, or even that we're lacking, or something that's achievable? I don't want us to commit to too many achievable goals. We do want to actually get on board to do this, but do we have any other thoughts or comments to a group?
Whether this could be achievable or not is another question, but we apart from what has already been said, we also saw that getting involved in public education would be so helpful in terms of empowering the population themselves. This could deter a number of or many tortures that would come up, because you find that some places where these abuses actually perpetuated is because people actually ignorant. Many of them have no idea how to demand for accountability from their leaders and so forth. But if they're empowered and they're educated, probably they could stand up against the torture. And then there's something that we also mentioned about international treaties by some other governments do impede the work of the human rights people, because you can really not do much if there are some international treaties that to a certain extent will limit you to pursue a case to a conclusion. And if you guys could look into those, some of those international treaties, and can you say something against them, about them? Can you stand against some, can you do something? That's a question. And the other one that has, I think, established international collaborations, I think, has been mentioned already. Do you have something to add?
I think you summarized it very well. We didn't really discuss. I was interested in this group for the countries involved, and frankly, I don't think issues of torture will arise and will be openly discussed in developed economies or developed countries, but rather the less developed or underdeveloped countries. And they seem to be quite rampant. And it's more on how they should be helped. And my suggestion was, I think they should start young as children. They should be educated. And because of maybe the vast population and the lack of resources and undivided resources, the underprivileged remain extremely underprivileged, and they don't even get to receive any basic education to know their rights, and therefore, before they even be subject to torture. So they should know their rights. And because I read this book, just flipped through strategic litigation, some of the cases reflected quite well that you need to actually cooperate, unify, march in unison, and champion for some rights. And I think the basic right that one should champion for is right to education, freedom of speech, before you even come to the issue of torture. I mean, this is, we just discussed very loosely.
No, thank you very much for sharing the conversation. I think that's a really good thing to note. Human rights education sometimes not talked about enough when we try to talk about how do we solve the problem on the other end. And definitely public engagement and how do we do that on this topic, especially in countries where it may be dangerous to discuss this too openly, is something that don't get discussed enough as well. So these are definitely things that we do want to flesh out. So thanks for sharing that conversation as well. I think we are now at the official closing time of the symposium, and thank you very much for sticking around and actually helping us draw out a real plan of what we can send around as a proposal to the delegates and pull everyone together to say, look, is this something that we wish to collaborate on and continue to collaborate on. And on that note, we just want to thank everyone for coming here, flying from across the world, as well as people who are here in Hong Kong giving up their weekend to have this conversation with us. I want to thank all our partners, our sponsors, as well as the Justice Centre team who has worked tirelessly to make this happen. CCPL team as well, who have been here all weekend making sure everything runs smoothly. Pierre for driving this idea, from which the idea came from in the first place. And last but not least, Lisa everyone here will have been in touch with Lisa already, and she has put tremendous thought and tirelessly worked to make this weekend just perfect for this conversation, and I cannot thank her enough for making this possible.
Wow. So, yeah, thank you, Lynette, for all the thank yous to everyone. But for those that joined us for the weekend, we actually had 2 days before, which was the launch of Open Society Justice Initiative's report on strategic litigation. So we've actually been it's been a 4-day rally for us. And so I just want to also thank Jade, because Jade stepped in at the absolute last minute when Louise hurt her foot, but also Jade's actually been very involved in the launch and in helping all of that. So we have a small thing for Jade as well. So.
Thank you very much. Expect an email. There will be emails. Thank you so much for helping with you. No, I didn't. I saw him, but I didn't. we will send out an email saying that this is that's great. This is the MA. Do you call it MAG for short? Yeah. MAG. Yeah. This is MAG.